The night was quiet, and the streets felt unusually empty. It was the kind of night when the world seemed to slow down, where the hum of everyday life was almost non-existent. A lone police officer was driving through a neighborhood he knew well. He had made this route countless times, watching the same streets, the same buildings, the same faces passing by. There was something oddly peaceful about the night, almost too peaceful. He was starting to feel like the only person awake in the entire city. As he passed by an old phone booth tucked into a corner of a dimly lit street, something caught his eye. A girl. She was standing inside the booth, her silhouette framed by the faint light. She looked out of place, especially in such an isolated area. The officer slowed his patrol car, unsure of what he was seeing. People didn't normally hang around phone booths anymore, not in this age of cell phones and instant communication. The booth hadn't been used in years, and the girl seemed out of place standing there in the middle of the night. He couldn't tell much about her from the distance. She was young, dressed in dark clothing, and seemed to be deep in thought. There was something about her that made the officer's curiosity grow. He wasn't sure why, but there was an odd feeling in his gut. Maybe it was the time of night, or the way she was standing there, but he had a hunch that something wasn't right. The officer turned off the engine of his car and sat in silence for a moment, watching her. She didn't appear to be doing anything wrong. She wasn't panicking or looking over her shoulder like she was afraid of being seen. No, she stood there calmly, almost as if she belonged in that very spot. Still, the officer's instincts were telling him to stay alert. He was trained to notice the unusual, the unexpected, and right now, this was definitely one of those moments. He stared at her for a few more seconds, unsure if he should approach. The neighborhood was quiet, but there were always surprises lurking when you least expected them. Maybe she was just waiting for someone, or maybe something was off, but there was something strange about the way she was standing there. She wasn't just looking around or standing idly. She was focused on something. Her attention seemed entirely consumed by whatever she was doing at that moment. After what felt like an eternity, the officer saw her raise the receiver of the payphone. He frowned, wondering if she had a reason to use the phone at this late hour. Most people in the area didn't even bother with old phones like this anymore. It was all cell phones and text messages. But there she was, dialing a number in the dead of night. The officer's curiosity got the best of him. He had no reason to think anything was wrong, but something about this felt off. Slowly, he reached for his radio, deciding that it was better to be cautious. It was always safer to check when you weren't sure about something. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but his instincts told him to keep an eye on her, just in case. He watched her through the windshield, his eyes narrowed, waiting for her next move. The officer continued to watch, his eyes glued to the girl in the phone booth. She had now picked up the receiver and was holding it to her ear, her body language calm but purposeful. The officer couldn't make out her words, but he could see her lips moving. She was speaking to someone on the other end of the line. The street remained eerily quiet around her, but the conversation in the booth seemed to be growing more intense with each passing moment. The officer adjusted his position in the patrol car, trying to get a better view of what was happening. The girl's expression didn't change. Her focus was entirely on the conversation she was having. There was a certain seriousness to the way she spoke. She wasn't laughing, wasn't making idle small talk. Whatever was being discussed seemed to matter a great deal to her. It felt out of place, almost as if she were talking about something important, something more significant than a simple phone call. He continued to observe, still uncertain about what was going on. People made phone calls all the time, especially in public places. It wasn't unusual to see someone in a phone booth, even at this hour, though it was rare. The officer had seen people waiting for calls or talking to friends, but this felt different. There was no casualness to her body language, no indication that this was just an ordinary call. Her movements were measured, careful, as though she were in the middle of something far more serious. Then he noticed something even stranger. As the girl continued her conversation, She began to speak in a tone that was much more controlled, almost like she was giving instructions or receiving some sort of briefing. The officer furrowed his brow, wondering if he was just overthinking things. After all, people had all kinds of conversations, some serious, some lighthearted. But this was different. The girl's voice, though soft, carried an authority that made the officer feel uneasy. He couldn't hear every word, but he could make out a few phrases. She was mentioning specific places, specific names, things that didn't sound like the usual small talk you'd expect in a phone booth. His interest piqued. The officer strained to hear more, his curiosity building with every word he caught. She wasn't talking about a normal errand or a simple chat. No, she was speaking with an intensity that suggested something much more complex, something larger than just a regular phone call. The officer felt his pulse quicken slightly. He had been a cop for a long time, and he knew the feeling of instinct telling him that something was wrong. Maybe he was being overly cautious, but his gut told him this situation deserved more attention. The calmness in the girl's demeanor only added to his suspicion. Why wasn't she nervous? Why wasn't she looking around, aware of her surroundings? Was she involved in something dangerous, or was he reading too much into it? As the conversation continued, the officer found himself leaning forward in his seat, hanging on every word. He couldn't help but feel like this was the start of something he wasn't prepared for. This wasn't just another quiet night on patrol. Something was unfolding right before his eyes, and he couldn't look away. The officer's mind was racing. His instincts were telling him that something was happening right in front of him. Something important, something that couldn't be ignored. He had to stay calm, but the more he watched the girl in the phone booth, the more his curiosity grew. His eyes remained fixed on her, but his thoughts were all over the place. What was she talking about? Who was on the other end of the line? Why did she sound so calm and collected when everything else about the situation felt so strange? He sat in his patrol car, watching the girl as she continued her conversation. It was as if the world around them had faded away, leaving only the two of them in this silent exchange. The streets were still quiet, and no one else seemed to be around. It felt like a moment frozen in time. The girl hadn't looked up once, hadn't seemed to notice him or anything else happening in the world around her. Her focus was entirely on the phone call. The officer glanced down at his radio, his finger hovering over the button. He wasn't sure if he should call for backup yet. It was such a small thing, really, just a girl on a phone. But everything about this situation felt off. The way she stood there, the calmness in her voice, the secrecy of the conversation, it didn't feel like something he should just brush off. He had been on patrol long enough to recognize when his gut was telling him to be cautious, and right now, that was exactly what it was doing. He continued to watch, hoping for some kind of clue, something that would make sense of the strange situation unfolding in front of him. But the more he listened, the less he understood. She wasn't talking about anything he could easily make sense of. There were no casual words, no small talk about the weather or plans for the weekend. Instead, it sounded like she was giving someone instructions, urgent instructions. A part of him felt like he should leave it alone, like he was making a big deal out of something that was probably harmless. After all, she could just be having a late-night conversation with a friend or family member, right? But then he remembered his training. He had been taught that sometimes the most dangerous situations started with something as simple as a phone call. He couldn't let his guard down. Not now, not when his instincts were telling him to stay alert. The officer's hand moved slowly toward the radio, but before he could make the decision to call for backup, the girl spoke again. And this time her words caught his attention in a way that made his heart skip a beat. He couldn't hear all of it, but a few words stood out clearly. "I need help now." His breath caught in his throat. Those words changed everything. This wasn't just a regular conversation. There was something serious going on. The officer's hand gripped the radio now, his mind racing to process what he had just heard. He needed backup, and he needed it fast. But what kind of situation was he walking into? He had no idea, but he knew one thing for sure. This was no ordinary phone call. The officer's heart was racing as he listened to the girl on the phone, the urgency in her voice impossible to ignore. He had heard her say, "I need help now," and those words had sent a shockwave through him. Something was definitely happening here, something that was much bigger than just a girl having a late-night chat. His mind was filled with questions, and his thoughts were spinning faster than he could keep up with. He had already decided to call for backup, but the words kept echoing in his head. Who was she talking to? What kind of help did she need? And why had she come here, of all places, to make this call? He couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of something important, something that could change everything. He had dealt with many situations during his career, but none quite like this. He had a gut feeling that this wasn't just an ordinary phone call. It felt like it was part of something much larger, something he wasn't prepared for. His hand hovered over the radio for a few seconds, uncertainty creeping into his thoughts. Maybe he was jumping to conclusions. Maybe she was just a person in trouble. But what kind of trouble was she in? The officer knew the city well, and nothing about this area felt like it should be connected to something so serious. Still, his instincts told him to be cautious, and caution was always better than ignoring a possible threat. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her voice again. This time, the words were clearer, and he caught something that sent a chill down his spine. "They'll be here soon. I need you to hold the line until they arrive." The way she said it made him realize this wasn't just a random emergency. There was someone else involved, someone she was waiting for, someone she expected to show up. But who were they? And why was she alone? The officer leaned back in his seat, trying to process everything he had just heard. He had no idea what kind of situation he was stepping into, but whatever it wasn't going to be simple. The way she spoke, the urgency in her tone, it was as if she was involved in something far more serious than he could have imagined. There was a kind of quiet power in her words, a confidence that made him wonder if she was used to dealing with difficult situations. With no time to waste, he finally picked up his radio and called for backup. His voice was steady, but inside, he was alert and ready for anything. The girl in the phone booth hadn't noticed him yet, and he wasn't about to make his presence known just yet. He needed more information. He needed to know who she was talking to and why it was so urgent. But most of all, he needed to be prepared for whatever was about to unfold. As the call for backup went out, the officer couldn't help but feel the tension in the air. The stillness of the night seemed to hang heavy around him. He had no idea what he was about to face, but he knew it wouldn't be ordinary. The girl was still in the booth, still on the phone, still waiting for someone. And the officer had a feeling that when that someone arrived, everything would change. The officer's mind was running through possible scenarios as he sat in the patrol car, watching the girl in the phone booth. The silence around him felt thick, as though the world was holding its breath. His radio crackled with the call for backup, but it felt like an eternity before anyone would arrive. He had made the decision to act, but now it was just a waiting game. He had no idea what was coming, but every instinct in his body told him that this was far from a typical night on patrol. He glanced back at the girl in the phone booth, her body still facing the receiver as she continued to speak. Her voice was soft, almost too soft for the officer to hear from this distance, but the urgency was unmistakable. She wasn't just passing time. She was waiting for something, or someone. The officer could sense the tension in the air, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the moment was about to change. There was something about the way she spoke into the phone that made him feel like he was on the edge of uncovering something big, something he hadn't expected to encounter tonight. What was she involved in? Who was she talking to? And why did she need help so desperately? The officer's thoughts kept circling back to these questions, but there were no answers. It was all just fragments, pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. The more he thought about it, the more uncertain he became. This was a situation that was so far outside the ordinary, so beyond the realm of what he usually dealt with, that he didn't know how to approach it. The girl's voice came through again, and this time, The officer could hear a few more words clearly. "Stay calm. We'll take care of it." The officer's breath caught in his chest. "We'll take care of it." Who was we? Was she working with someone else? Who else could be involved in something like this? His heart rate picked up as the pieces of the puzzle seemed to slip further out of reach, just beyond his grasp. The officer wasn't sure whether he should get out of the car and confront her now, or if he should wait for backup. Every instinct in his body told him to stay back, to observe from a distance until he knew more. It was the professional thing to do. But the urgency of the situation was making it harder to stay still. Every second felt like it was slipping away, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to act before it was too late. The girl continued her conversation, and though the officer couldn't hear every word, he could see the way she held herself. She was confident, calm, and composed in a way that was hard to ignore. She didn't seem scared. She didn't seem out of control. In fact, she seemed to be in charge, even though she was standing alone in the phone booth on a quiet street corner. The officer was left to wonder how much she really knew, how much power she had, and what kind of situation she had gotten herself into. His eyes flicked back to the radio, where the call for backup was still hanging in the air, unanswered. Time was moving slowly, but he knew he had to stay vigilant. Whatever was happening here, whatever this girl was involved in, it was only a matter of time before he would find out. And he had to be ready for it. The officer sat in the patrol car, feeling a rising sense of urgency with every passing second. His fingers tapped nervously on the steering wheel as his eyes remained focused on the girl in the phone booth. There was something in the way she stood, the way she spoke into the receiver, that made him feel like he was on the verge of uncovering something much bigger than he could have anticipated. He tried to stay calm, tried to remind himself that backup was on the way, but his instincts were telling him that this situation could escalate at any moment. Every time the girl spoke, her voice carried a sense of authority, as if she had been through situations like this before. It was unusual, especially for someone so young. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't showing any signs of distress. Instead, she was controlled, precise, as if she had rehearsed this conversation 1,000 times. The officer couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching a scene unfold that was far beyond the ordinary. Who was she talking to? And what exactly was so urgent? As the minutes ticked by, the officer felt his patience wearing thin. He glanced at the radio again, waiting for a response from backup. The streets were still quiet, the night unchanged, but he couldn't help but feel like time was slipping away. If this was a simple emergency, why hadn't the girl seemed more anxious? Why did she appear so calm, so collected, when someone on the other end of the phone was apparently asking for her to act fast? The officer's thoughts raced, each question building more confusion, yet the answers were still just out of reach. He had made the right decision to call for backup, but now, with every second that passed, it felt like the situation was slipping further from his control. The girl seemed unaware of the officer's growing tension. She stood there, still speaking into the phone, her voice a steady stream of words that seemed to echo in the officer's mind. He could only make out fragments, but enough to understand that she wasn't just asking for help. She was orchestrating something. "Stay in place," she said quietly, the words sharp and deliberate. "I'll be there soon." The officer's grip tightened on the steering wheel. Who was coming? He wondered. The calmness in her voice didn't match the urgency of the situation. If she was involved in something that required help so badly, why didn't she seem more concerned? It didn't add up. The officer knew he couldn't sit idly by much longer. He needed more information, but confronting her now might push things too far, too fast. His eyes flickered to the dark street around him. There was no one else in sight. The stillness of the night felt even more oppressive now, and the girl was still there, still on the phone, still waiting for something or someone. The thought that he might be the only one who could intervene kept running through his mind. His job was to protect, to ensure the safety of everyone around him. But this situation was unlike any other he had faced. As the officer wrestled with his thoughts, The sound of sirens in the distance broke through his concentration. Backup was finally on the way. Relief mixed with the anxiety that had been building in him all night. He wasn't alone anymore, but he still didn't know what to expect. The girl hadn't even looked in his direction, her focus entirely on the phone call. She seemed so detached from the world around her, so immersed in whatever conversation she was having. The officer took a deep breath, ready for whatever would come next. He had done what he could to prepare, but he still didn't know the full extent of what was happening. The girl in the phone booth wasn't just waiting for help. She was part of something much bigger, and the officer was about to find out what. The officer sat in his car, eyes fixed on the phone booth, his mind swirling with possibilities. The silence was thick now, almost suffocating. Backup was on the way, but as he waited, he felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. The girl in the booth was still speaking, still as calm and composed as she had been since the moment he first noticed her. She hadn't moved, hadn't shown any sign of distress, but there was something about her that kept him on edge. The seconds felt like minutes as the officer tried to make sense of what was happening. Who was she talking to? Why was she so calm in the face of what sounded like a serious situation? He had heard her say that someone was coming to help, but who was it? And why hadn't she seemed more concerned? It all felt too calculated, too precise. The officer had a gut feeling that this was no ordinary phone call, no simple emergency. His hand rested on the steering wheel, but he couldn't take his eyes off the girl. He was sure that whatever was unfolding, it was about to reach its tipping point. The girl seemed unaware of the officer's growing tension, completely absorbed in her conversation. She was speaking softly, but her words carried weight. Every sentence seemed to add to the mystery of the situation. The officer could hear her say a few more words clearly now. Stay hidden for now. It's almost time. Stay hidden. The officer's thoughts raced again. What was she involved in? Why did she need to stay hidden? It wasn't making any sense. The pieces were there, but they just didn't fit together. The calmness in her voice suggested she had control over whatever was happening, but he couldn't figure out how. Why wasn't she worried? Why wasn't she frantic like someone in a dangerous situation would be? He wanted to act, but something held him back. The backup was on its way, and as much as he hated to wait, he knew it was better to be cautious. Confronting her now might make everything worse, especially if he was missing something crucial. So he stayed in his car, watching her through the windshield, trying to piece together the fragments of this strange encounter. A few minutes passed, and just as the officer was starting to question his patience, the sound of sirens grew louder, signaling that backup was nearing. Relief washed over him, but only for a moment. He still didn't know what he was up against. The girl in the phone booth seemed unbothered by the approaching sirens, still standing there, speaking into the phone with the same steady, calm tone. She wasn't concerned, and that made the officer's stomach turn. The lack of fear, the lack of urgency, it was unsettling. He knew that the backup would help, but he also knew that they would need to act carefully. This wasn't a typical arrest or routine situation. The officer felt like he was on the brink of uncovering something much bigger than just an average night on patrol. But what? Who was she waiting for? And why had she been so sure that help was on the way? The backup officers arrived, and the officer signaled for them to approach slowly. He didn't want to startle the girl, not yet. He wanted to understand more, to gather more details before making his move. She was still on the phone, still speaking in that quiet, controlled voice. She didn't even flinch when the sirens stopped. She didn't even look their way. The officer exhaled slowly, preparing himself for whatever would happen next. Whatever this was, it wasn't over yet. The backup officers arrived, their presence adding a sense of urgency to the already tense situation. The officer in the patrol car felt the weight of their arrival, but he didn't rush. There was something crucial about the moment he was in, something that made him hesitant to act without understanding more. The girl in the phone booth was still on the line, her composure unshaken, as though the sirens and flashing lights didn't even exist in her world. The officer signaled to his colleagues to stay back, watching the girl intently. He was trying to piece everything together. Her calmness, her words, the way she held the phone as if it were a lifeline, as if it was the most important thing in the world. The longer he observed, the more convinced he became that there was far more to this situation than he had first imagined. "Stay hidden for now. It's almost time," she had said earlier. Those words echoed in his mind. Almost time for what? Who was she speaking to? And what was about to happen? His thoughts were interrupted as one of the backup officers approached him. "What's the situation?" she asked, her voice low and cautious. The officer paused for a moment, glancing back at the girl. "I don't know yet," he replied, his voice steady, though there was still uncertainty in his eyes. "She's been on the phone for a while now, speaking to someone, giving instructions. It's not your typical call for help. She's calm, too calm." The officer couldn't help but wonder if the girl knew exactly what she was doing, if she was orchestrating something far beyond what they could see. His gut was telling him to wait for just a moment longer. He had a feeling that what happened next could change everything, and he didn't want to miss the chance to understand it. The sirens faded as the backup officers moved into position, and the girl was still standing there, unaffected by the growing presence around her. She hadn't acknowledged the officers, hadn't shown any sign of panic. There was no fear in her demeanor. She simply continued with her quiet conversation, each word measured and purposeful. The officer took another slow breath, trying to prepare himself for the unknown. Who was she waiting for? What was this about? He didn't know yet, but he was about to find out. Then, just as the silence felt unbearable, the girl finally hung up the phone. She looked around for the first time, her eyes scanning the street, and her gaze locked with the officers. For a brief moment, neither of them moved. It was as if the world had paused. She didn't look surprised, didn't seem caught off guard. She simply stood there, waiting. The officer stepped out of his patrol car slowly, keeping his distance. He didn't want to make any sudden moves. He could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the moment hanging between them. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice steady but with a trace of concern. The girl's lips curled into a faint smile, a smile that held secrets the officer couldn't even begin to understand. "I'm fine," she said softly, her voice calm, but somehow reassuring. She didn't seem afraid, even with the officers surrounding her now. She didn't seem concerned at all. Before the officer could respond, she spoke again, her voice low but carrying an undeniable authority. "You should leave now. It's over." The officer was taken aback by her words. Over? What was over? Was there something more to this story that he was missing? He opened his mouth to ask, but she held up a hand, stopping him. "I'm not a threat," she said, her tone firm. "I never was. I'm just part of something bigger. And it's better that you don't know the details." The officers stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. The girl turned and began to walk away, not looking back. As she moved, the officer's mind was spinning. Everything about this encounter felt surreal. What had just happened? He had no answers, but he felt like he had just been part of something much larger than he could ever have imagined. He watched her disappear into the night, the sound of her footsteps fading as quickly as it had all begun. The backup officers were left standing in the stillness, each of them uncertain about what they had just witnessed. The officer who had first spotted her stood still, his eyes fixed on the spot where she had been, unable to shake the feeling that something had just shifted in the world around him. As the night returned to its quiet, unremarkable pace, he knew that this was a moment he would never forget. Whatever had just happened, whatever part he had played in it, he had been a witness to something bigger than any of them had understood. And for now, that was enough.